Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is Monday, February 12th, 2024, and I am very happy to have with me Aziz Alghashian. Aziz is a fellow at Sectarianism, Proxies and De-sectarianisation, CEPAD, and at the Center for Applied Research in Partnership with the Orient, CARPO. He is a Saudi researcher and analyst of Saudi foreign policy who earned his PhD at the University of Essex, where he taught international relations, politics, and Middle Eastern studies. And most important for today's podcast, the focus of Aziz's current research and writing, and I'll be mentioning a bunch of his writing in this podcast, and I'll be linking to it in the show notes. The focus is Saudi policy toward Israel and Arab-Israeli relations. So Aziz, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a real pleasure to join you, Lara. Thank you very much for having me.
So we're going to have a great far-reaching conversation. I want to give a quick sort of context intro for people. I don't know when they'll be watching or listening to this. The context for today's call, of course, is the now more than 4-month-long Israeli war on Gaza, during which Israel, ostensibly for the sake of quote-unquote eradicating Hamas and freeing hostages taken on October 7th, has systematically depopulated and destroyed most of the Gaza Strip. And today, as we're recording this podcast, Israel, as of last night, is unleashing a new military offensive against Rafah, which is located right next to the border with Egypt, where more than 1 million displaced Palestinians displaced from the rest of the Gaza Strip have crowded together seeking refuge. And last night was really a horrible night with a huge number of Palestinians killed and injured, and also 2 Israeli hostages rescued. So once again, Israel has publicly called on Palestinians in this area, which is now was about to be overrun, we fear, to evacuate, but this time there is truly nowhere else left to go, except potentially outside of Gaza, which since the beginning of this war has been the expressed objective of some people in Israel. So throughout this more than 4 months of horror, the role or potential role or aspirational role of Saudi Arabia has loomed large, mainly because Saudi Arabia is arguably one of the few parties that has something that Israel badly wants, which is normalization. And it's one of the few parties that appears as yet unwilling to simply overlook Israel's treatment of Palestinians. And the as yet is important here because at least until the past couple of weeks, there still appeared to be something of a certainty, or at least a very strong hope among Israeli analysts and among pro-Israel pundits, including in the US and the Biden administration, that some kind of grand bargain could be struck with Saudi Arabia, and that such a bargain would be the key to resolving this war. And of course, such a bargain would be for the White House a huge foreign policy achievement. And for Israel, it would be a key to securing a sort of day after, I'm using air quotes, scenario that would achieve a lot of Israeli objectives, including offering Arab political cover for what Israel has done in Gaza up until now, laying the groundwork for a post-war new political status quo for Palestinians, in which Palestinians have little or no agency, securing Arab world buy-in and financial support, particularly Saudi support for post-war Palestinian needs, and giving the government of Israel a high-value achievement and political and economic deliverable as proof of their victory in this war. So with all of that as context, Aziz, I'm now going to let you talk. As of February 6th, on February 6th, I should say, the Saudi government issued a statement, and I'll link to this in the show notes, affirming, among other things, and here I'm quoting, "There will be no diplomatic relations with Israel unless an independent Palestinian state is recognized on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital," and going on that this is not possible unless the, quote, "Israel aggression on the Gaza Strip stops and all Israeli occupation forces withdraw from the Gaza Strip." And I'll note the headline in the Saudi outlet Ashaq al-Awsat a couple of days later was, quote, "Saudi statement puts an end to use of normalization for electoral purposes." So can you start us out today by helping me and our audience understand the purpose and meaning of the statement from the kingdom, including, why now? What prompted it? And beyond taking the words at face value, which is pretty clear what they say, what is the intended message and to what audiences? What does it say specifically about the relationship between the Saudi government and the Biden administration?
Well, thank you very much, Lara, for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to join you. I've been following your work for a while, and so I really do appreciate being here with you. So thank you very much. No, I think it's very interesting because this is not the first time that Saudi Arabia made these demands for the Palestinians, and especially calling for 1967 and East Jerusalem as its capital, etc. But I think why this in particular this statement is of particular interest is because it came against the backdrop of what the National Security Council spokesperson Kirby, I think his name is John Kirby, if I'm not wrong, said in a press conference the day before that essentially, when asked how was Saudi Arabia, or how was the Saudi negotiations, or the negotiations with Saudi Arabia and Israel, or Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, how is it going? He said, well, that's a different track than the hostage element, and that's a different track than trying to have the ceasefire, and therefore, essentially, somewhat implicitly suggesting that the Saudis are just simply using the Palestinians here, or using the issue of Palestine to gain something from the United States, and that in essence that this is something that they don't care about, and they're openly negotiating, and this is something that I think the Saudi ruling elite has been really patient over, because a great deal of time, and I think as you mentioned earlier in your introduction, that there's a lot of hope. I would say there's a lot of not only hope, but there's a lot of desperation to really see a normalization take place. I think hope is also they always had hope, and the hope has always been there. But I think in the past year, especially after the Abraham Accords, there has been a great deal of hope, and there's been a great deal of desperation. And I think the Saudis and the Saudi ruling elite really sense that. And as a result, when they sense that, the dynamics has altered. Now, alongside negotiations, and alongside insisting on concessions from Israel to the Palestinians as a prerequisite for normalization, Saudi Arabia gave its own demands as well. And that was due to, in my estimation, this desperation that they illustrated both in Tel Aviv and in Washington, D.C. And I think what has happened also is that in this attempt to be in this desperation of normalization, there's been a fogginess of understanding what the Saudi position is. And that's why this statement was very interesting, because I think, to be fair, we are not very we're not very frequent with this information, with the information that we leave. It's often viewed as symbolic. A lot of the times things happen on the Palestinian-Israeli front, and people expect to hear something from Saudi Arabia and to hear more, and they probably don't, etc. So they assume that there is something that is not that they have simply given up. But I think what this shows is that no, this is we or the Saudi ruling elite have said, I think the Sharq al-Awsat really put it succinctly: stop normalizing, stop politicizing us. And to be honest, Lara, this speaks to a very interesting point, and a more important point, of who is narrating Saudi Arabia. For me, this is the most important, one of the most important, one of the things that scream out. Of course, the Palestinian issue is there, but who narrates the Saudi issue regarding the Palestinian issue globally, or at least whose narrative is the one that resonates mostly? And it's not the Saudi narrative. And I think there's unfortunately not only a great deal of desperation, but there's a great deal of, just like there's disinformation, there's also a disframing of the Saudi position. They like to take bits and bobs and customize Saudi statements, which are not simple. It's not direct, because for Saudi Arabia, what they see in Israel, what they see the Israeli file as part of a broader American file, not necessarily as a bilateral relationship. So this is not a bilateral relationship. The Saudi-Israeli relations is a trilateral relationship. And as a result, this is a cause for fogginess. And I think this ecosystem of fogginess, this machine of fogginess, comprises of a great deal of desperation. And from Tel Aviv, there's I wrote not too long ago in the summer, there's a strategic speculation comes out of Israel that something's happening, stand by, everyone, for their own political purposes. And then in Washington, D.C., what's very interesting is that normalization has now kind of seemed to have been absorbed into the politics within Washington, D.C. You tell me if I'm right or wrong, but that's my perception. And then there's a very significant, there's a very fluid Saudi discourse towards Israel. It's always been fluid. And just to give an example, and then I'll wrap up, because I tend to talk too much, so forgive me. But Saudis have always been good at yes, but. The Saudi willingness to have peace with Israel is nothing new. The Saudi willingness to have normalization with Israel is nothing new. But they always had that but. And I always spoke to people, and I always say, it reminds me of that song, I like big butts and I cannot lie. There's just so many, it's just the but there. And and you can't ignore this big but. But the thing is, people don't want to see what they said before. So you see people saying, yes, Israel, we could have cooperation with Israel. We could have normalization with Israel. We could have, but this very big but at the Palestinian issue, a just settlement, the Arab Peace Initiative. I think in this fogginess and this discourse, they've always looked at what is before the condition is there, and therefore they get to play with it. And I think the Saudi statement had illustrated that they've reached the limit of this discussion and this politicization. And in my opinion, I anticipate now people will take what DC and Tel Aviv say about Saudi-Israeli relations, or Saudi relations vis-a-vis the Palestinians and Israelis, with a lot more of a pinch of salt.
So I want to say I agree with your assessment of Washington and normalization. I was speaking, and you heard me recently talk about normalization as the unobtainium of the diplomatic process. It's the rare element that we think exists, may exist, hard to find, but if we had it, it would fix everything. I will say that you're the first person I've ever had on a podcast to reference Sir Mix-a-Lot, which alone is awesome. So we're going to come back to Saudi official statements in a second. I want to ask you, though, to take a step back from the current events, and we'll come back to them. And I want to ask you to talk about a piece, or I want to talk to you about something else you wrote about in November 2022, which I think the first time I actually became really interested in your work. I saw this. It was entitled "The Depth of the Palestinian Ingredient in Saudi Political Identity and Projection." And I'll have a link. And I'm going to quote you here. You wrote, "Saudi identity and the kingdom's history with the Palestinians is a major reason preventing the Saudi ruling elite from jumping on the Abraham Accords wagon, as the role of the Palestinian cause in Saudi identity is deep and complex. What is more, there are elements within Saudi social and political discourses that have further entrenched the Palestinian cause and Saudi identity. Saudi projection of the kingdom's service to Islam, socio-political narratives championing Saudi kings, and commitment to the Arab Peace Initiative embed the Palestinian cause in Saudi identity and help explain why Saudis may not be in favor of embracing Israel, at least in public." And then as we come back in a more recent piece that you wrote about the Arab Peace Initiative, we're going to talk about the API in a little bit. You noted, "Saudi pragmatism towards Israel," I'm quoting, "has often been conflated with a disvalue of Palestinian rights. This is certainly a misreading." And you go on to add, "Such a misunderstanding is used by political elites in Israel to isolate the Palestinians further from regional normalization. Just before the eruption of the war, the Israeli prime minister tried to push the narrative that Saudis no longer care about the Palestinians and that negotiations should negate any regard for Palestinian rights. So with all of that in mind, can you talk about
Mhm.
how Palestinians, talk more about this, as a people and a cause, figure
Mhm.
into Saudi political identity, and in that way figure into what the Saudi government's own thinking is when it comes to their public positioning, the limits on their public positioning, and
Mhm.
how that shapes or limits their room to maneuver on policy?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that. It's very interesting. And let me just say this. As you mentioned also in your introduction, when you introduced me in your very generous introduction, you said that I did my PhD in the University of Essex, basically in the United Kingdom. Let me share with you this. And this is something that really came up as I was living here. Researching about Saudi Arabia outside of Saudi Arabia is very different than researching about Saudi Arabia within Saudi Arabia. And as studying the same topic, but in a different place, I had a very different perspective. I'll be honest. And it really did change. And I must say, when I was in the UK, I didn't see that. When I began to live in Saudi because of COVID and everything came back, I had a better understanding, I mean, I'm Saudi Arabian, I was still Saudi Arabian a couple of years ago, but I mean, when living here, you get to see how this is entrenched in Saudi identity. And what I meant by that is by projecting itself, by championing itself, because there is also a rise in Saudi nationalism in past few years. And part of that nationalism at times could be addressing anybody that is standing against Saudis. And sometimes the Palestinian issue gets caught up in that. But one of the aspects that I find very fascinating is that when there is this boasting of leadership, boasting of honor, and the fact that the Saudis have not yielded to this Western pressure, Western pressure of trying to normalize relations with Israel, have not really, and it's not also just yielded to Israel or yielded to the United States, which is still actually very prominent in the social discourses, because unfortunately, they still, the perception of the United States is still viewed as the orchestrator of a lot of trouble. And they see this, for example, in its response in the Arab Spring. They see this in the response to the JCPOA. They see this and they're like, they're conspiring against us. So, and therefore, when you have an American president that's trying to push for normalization, and they say no, and the Saudi ruling elite no, this gives a great sense of pride. And then all of a sudden, this is where you see how the Palestinian issue is here. We refuse to yield to this. And look at an example of this is the fact that we have not normalized relations with the Palestinians. And that the Palestinians is a cause. Look at that, and as a result of that just cause, as a result of the iniquity they face, we haven't yielded. And that's not something that happened then. That's something that we see now, especially after that statement. Because even kings, especially King Faisal, who was the king during the 1973 Ramadan Yom Kippur War, he is still lionized by Saudis till now. Till now. So the fact that, and especially now against this horrendous campaign and this atrocious campaign that they're at the receiving end now, the Palestinian issue is back on the psyche of many Saudis. There's no going around it. And where's the Saudi kind of position? The Saudis see these statements and it just entrenches the Palestinian issue in the Saudi identity. So it's kind of used also to project. So there's an element of it of support, and there's an element of it as a mechanism of even projecting more nobleness and honor. And therefore, whether it's kind of either or, if it's for the Palestinian issue explicitly, or if it's for projecting leadership per se, it's still entrenched. And what this does is that, in my opinion, it just makes the cost of normalization higher because the public discourse is altering. And also, it just makes sure that the Palestinian issue can't go anywhere. And the Saudi ruling elite and their calculation, it's, there has to be, it must be a significant element, because without it, I'm not really sure it could be legitimized. So and I think they know this very well. And just the last point on this. So I said before, I think in that piece in 2022, that they were lionized, that King Faisal, for example, was lionized. Right now, what has taken place after that statement, the February 6th statement, MBS pictures of MBS and King Faisal were a portrait of them and images of them kind of sitting together, looking at each other, kind of a split screens of them kind of sitting. And so MBS was likened to someone as revered as King Faisal. And now you see how this is how the issue plays in and exists and manifests in Saudi identity and projection. And you even hear it time and again, even in Saudi social discourses, that we're not the ones to yield, that we still withheld to the Palestinian issue. And just the last point, this is part of our social political fabric. Other countries don't have that as part of their social political fabric. And as a result, that gives them more space to embrace Israel a bit more, or embrace Israel with less elements to the Palestinian issue. So that's regarding, I think, the first part of your question. And then there's the other one that I wrote about the Arab Peace Initiative, et cetera. But I mean, I don't know if you want me to expand upon that, or
I want to come back to the Arab Peace Initiative in a little while. I think that your answer is really, it's very helpful, because those of us who are trying to analyze what the Saudi thinking is. I mean, what you talked about the strategic speculation before. There's a tremendous amount of strategic speculation, which is on a fairly constant basis making the argument that the Palestinian issue is largely irrelevant to Saudi thinking, Saudi calculations, to the extent that it's being raised basically as a red herring to try to like wrest other concessions, or as a negotiating tactic. And you seem to be suggesting quite strongly that's not the case. I actually would wonder, after October 7th, when you have what's happening in Gaza being live streamed, and even if most Americans are not watching it, my sense is that across the region, between TikTok and regional news, people are watching what is looking like a live stream genocide. So that seems to even that seems to suggest that what you're saying now would be even more true after October 7th than it was before.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I think not only that, not only is it the sentiments, the social sentiments, not only the public opinion, but there's the regional opinion, because I think Saudi Arabia also cares about regional, there's a regional legitimacy to this too, because again, just before leading up to October 7th, or just leading up to October 7th. So from the onset, from 2022, 2023, you could see Saudi as it was after it was established more domestically, because there were a lot of issues domestically that was still not solved, that was still, I would say, contingent, and I would say from 2015 to 2020 and 22. After that was resolved, you see now Saudi reemerging as a regional player and also as a regional leader. And I think it senses this. And I think there's a new tacit bid for leadership in the region. So that's one element. But I think also the more significant one, and that more pertinent to October 7th, I think before the Saudi perspective, the Saudi lens on the Palestinian issue was one of a normative lens. whether it's an Arab lens that it viewed the situation, a normative lens, an Islamic lens. And these are the things that kind of they viewed it. Now there's something deeper. Or I'm sorry, I won't say it's something, there's something else, which is now they're viewing it from a regional security lens. Because in my opinion, looking at what the Saudis were saying before, they were saying, listen, the region cannot move on with this occupation there. The resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli question must be addressed if we want to move on and prosper in the region. In my estimation, this seems like a security issue, and it was viewed as a theoretical concern. After October 7th, it became a real concern. It became an empirical, clear, explicit concern. And that's what I think now Saudis are seeing this. And also, Saudi is trying to cause an more integrated region. And as a result, spillover effects now are become a lot quicker. And therefore, I think it understands that, you know, the reason why a great deal of this turbulence is down to the occupation. And, you know, it is the beacon of this. And actually today I had a few discussions with my friends. We were talking in a working session that we have sometimes. And, you know, we were saying how, the thing on the Red Sea, the Houthis and what they're doing. And what's very fascinating about how Saudis see this, they don't see it detached from what's taking place in Gaza. They say it is linked. And there's like this kind of tactical, rhetorical jostle of, is it linked? Is it not linked? No, this is something because, you know, the Houthis are just crazy. Okay, the Houthis, that's a different story. But what's interesting is that it's interesting how Saudi Arabia sees this as linked, and what's taken place in Gaza now is an amplification of a great deal of these security threats that are happening in the region, that are present and that are dormant. So you have these non-state actors that are there. They require a great deal of sensitivity and a very delicate mix of diplomacy, a little bit of deterrence, a little bit of incentive, you know, it's a very delicate situation to deal with these things. And then all of a sudden erupts the situation in Gaza, and then everything just gets amplified security-wise again. So yeah, that's the regional security issue is one of essence.
Well, that actually is a really good lead into the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, in my introduction, I laid out what, in my mind, are some of the key U.S. and Israeli objectives wrapped up in the efforts to have this grand deal with Saudi Israel normalization. But looking back to December, you wrote a really, really interesting piece in Foreign Policy entitled "How Saudi Arabia Could Use Its Leverage in Gaza." And you wrote, and quoting, "Before Riyadh steps up and shows greater assertiveness on this issue, the Saudi ruling elites need to see a clear political horizon and an improved structure to the peace process. At that point, they might use their considerable financial leverage to shape the outcome." So I want you to dig in a little bit about what leverage Saudi sees itself as having. I mean, maybe it's just the financial part, maybe it's more, and potentially would be willing to employ, including with respect to Israeli hopes or even expectations that Saudi will lead in footing the bill for Palestinian needs the day after, whatever the day after is and whatever that is, the Gaza war ends. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So the question of leverage here is very fascinating, because I think the dynamics of leverage has changed. And just before, how Saudi tried to use its leverage on this to exert pressure to bring a better outcome from the Palestinians, is that their relationship is with the United States, and it was one of resources and oil and arms, etc. And therefore, the Saudis would use the leverage what they have with the United States, and then they will hope that the United States could use its leverage on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So it's a long kind of road of leverage.
It's
but
quite and it's indirect. It's quite indirect.
it's very indirect, yes, and it's complex, but that the dynamic of leverage has changed, and because of the Abraham Accords. And it's so fascinating now. And the reason why Saudi has so much leverage, in my opinion, is because it's not in what it's doing. It's in its in it it is in what it is not doing, which is normalized relations. So there's leverage. There are two spheres now. So Saudi Arabia has two spheres of leverage now, two aspects of leverage that is very fascinating. So this is before October 7th. That as a result of the Abraham Accords, there's this great deal of expectation. And unfortunately, people look at the Gulf in a monolithic fashion. They all have funny things on their head. They all kind of have nice, beautiful dark milk chocolatey skin, and therefore these people all look alike, talk alike, whatever. This is the perception of Gulf Orientalism, because this is one of the things that I wanted to also touch upon. And then it's like, what am the United Arab Emirates kind of normalized? What's wrong with Saudi? What's happening in Saudi? Saudi, what's going on? So as a result, this is what caused this desperation to normalize relations. And they're saying, hey, and Saudi then said, look, if you want to normalize, this is what you have to do. As a result, the power was in Saudi Arabia's hands. Now, after October 7th, and all this notion of trying to reconstruct Gaza on very, I would say, let me just put it mildly, very unwise deduction and unwise perception, in other words, nonsense, that was coming out of Tel Aviv, and especially Netanyahu, which is that, yeah, don't worry, the reconstruction of Gaza is left to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and the Gulf. And for me, one of the things that I wrote about, or what I tried to even expand upon, was that, how insulting this was. The fact that you may think that, firstly, we don't care about this issue so much that we're just going to rebuild it for who? For you? For your security? And secondly, the Saudis are not unwilling to do this. But why would they do this? So it goes back to the question, I'm sorry, but why would they do this for no political horizon? So for me, this goes back again to this question of narrative. And this is where it really touches upon the notion of Gulf Orientalism, or Orientalizing the Gulf, as in we in the GCC are viewed as these the ATM of the world, as if our job is simply to throw money at other people's problems. And moreover, as people that spend first and think later, and that we're irrational, that we just, here's some money, here's some, and this is how I think it struck a chord also with me as someone from the GCC. And I said, well, firstly, Saudis would be happy to support the Palestinians financially. That's what they've been doing for a while anyway. But why would they? And especially the fact that a lack of construction of Gaza suggests that there's a security threat for Israel, that they're actually, this campaign can be contributing towards Israel's insecurity in the long run later on, and maybe even in the near term as well. But that's a different issue. And therefore, in order to rebuild it properly, will require funds. But what are the Saudis gonna do you think they're gonna do it for free? There must be a Palestinian issue. This must be a political horizon. And there must be not only a political horizon of promises. I think, in my opinion, and in my research of Saudi policy towards Israel, Saudi done a lot of significant steps for Israeli promises. So, for example, it reduced a great deal of layers within the boycott, the Arab boycott of Israel, because of the Oslo Accords. And in fact, a lot of people don't know this, but Saudi was willing to remove its boycott on Israel in exchange for freezing of settlements during the Shamir government. But the Shamir government insisted. So again, I think Saudi now also, you're talking about a different Saudi. Saudi's not in the spend now and investment in the long run. It's far more transactional, because Saudi also has a great deal of its dilemmas too. It's restructuring its restructuring its economy as well, and therefore it has to make sense for it. And Saudi, in my opinion, it will be happy to give these funds to rebuild it, but as a result, this cannot be for free politically. This must be some elements. And that's now the other layer of leverage that they have.
That's really, I mean, I really appreciate what you're explaining here, and particularly the Gulf Orientalism piece of it, because there does seem to be this sense of a monolithic, almost caricatured Gulf, which is perfectly happy to normalize and do whatever, and effectively become the tools of permanently preventing any Palestinian agency because of economic benefits or political payoffs. And I think you are challenging that with a much more nuanced and complex view of things. So I appreciate that. I want to come back to sort of the Saudi state of mind, which we're all, as you said, there aren't a lot of statements that come out. So we're all left to sort of parse the statements that do come out. On January 27th, I've been looking at all the Saudi statements that have come out since October 7th, and there's a couple recent ones that really struck me. So on January 27th, the Saudi government issued a statement welcoming the decision of the International Court of Justice. This was the case of genocide that the South African government brought. The quote was, it welcomed the decision to, quote, put an end to all, that aims to put an end to all acts and declarations aimed at a real genocide against the Palestinian people in the besieged Gaza Strip. So it is using the term genocide, which I thought was remarkable. It also stressed, quote, the importance of the international community taking further measures for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, providing protections to the Palestinian people, holding the Israeli occupation forces accountable for all their systematic violations of international law and international humanitarian law. And I'd seen language from the Saudi government before talking about the need for Israel to respect international law. I hadn't seen language that seemed to suggest systematic violations. That felt like an escalation in language. And then just a couple of days ago, as Israel announced what was going to be this new offensive in Rafah, on February 10th, the ministry issued a statement warning of, quote, the very serious repercussions of storming and targeting the city of Rafah and the Gaza Strip, and it affirmed its, quote, categorical rejection and condemnation of the forcible deportations of Palestinians in Rafah. Goes on to say this, quote, this continued violation of international law and international humanitarian law confirms the need for an urgent convening of the UN Security Council to prevent Israel from causing an imminent humanitarian disaster for which everyone who supports the aggression is responsible. Again, that's a very pointed language that feels like an escalation. It appears to be calling for and embracing a UN role. It appears to be an implicit elbow at America and others who are preventing action at the UN. So I want to ask you, what should we make of this language? Has there been a shift in tone since October 7th, or am I imagining it? Is it important, the use of the word genocide back in January? And is it important, just a couple of days ago, this endorsement of UN action and language about repercussions, that word seemed quite striking to me. And assuming that there is a shift here, I guess I want you to speculate a little bit about if what we're seeing now is the emergence of red lines that shall not be crossed. And I'm thinking here particularly with respect to the deportation of Palestinians from Gaza, which sort of suggests, I think, for a lot of us, a regional refugee crisis. And if those are red lines, what would be the repercussions in Saudi policy for crossing them?
Thank you very much for this. And you know, there's one thing that kind of appeared to me when you're reading these statements, is that I don't think a lot of people read Saudi statements. I think a lot of people read about what others say about Saudi, and not the Saudi statements themselves. And that's one thing that I've tried to always do, is say, okay, a lot of people like to dismiss them and say, no, 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 but surely there's something else involved, which goes back to the misleading notion that you kind of alluded to, or you mentioned explicitly before, that you know, there's just this dismissal, there's this intention to dismiss Saudi. And I think, you know, that you could never negate what is said publicly and officially, for goodness sake. That is the policy. So I'll even add something else to these things. Officially, Saudi Arabia rejects the notion that this is a self-defense operation, that this was self-defense. And they've said that even in November. And even in the United Nations, they said that we even reject the notion that this is even anything has to remotely to do with self-defense. So you know, earlier in the campaign, Israel was trying to get any kind of nugget of information or hint from the Saudis, any kind of statement, something to illustrate the saying, well, don't worry, the Saudis and the UAE people are and the GCC people, they're with us. Don't worry, don't worry. And they didn't get that. And one of the aspects that they used here is that Saudi normally or naturally or traditionally, I will say, takes time before they make a statement. They don't. So if you look at, for example, the Abraham Accords, it took 6 days to make a statement. 6 days. Desert Storm and Desert Shield and Desert Storm, it took 5 days to make their position clear. This is a calculated bunch, and contrary to what many people perceive them, they're calculated. And I think that's precisely why the speed in which they make these statements. And the first day they said that we have been warning. This is the first statement that came out on October 7th or October 8th. We have been warning the international community that there's something explosive taking place. And this was a result of the repercussion of the instigations taking place by these governments. Now, by this government. So it's very fascinating how that was quick. And I think when it comes to the Saudi calculation, the perception also changed. What is also very fascinating is to see what was said on the social political aspect, or in other words, the social discourse, kind of step in or enter into the official discourse, which is hypocrisy. And a great deal of this, and you alluded to this, or you mentioned, I'm sorry, you didn't, you mentioned to this explicitly, which is, yeah, I think it was a nudge to the United States. And you're right, all these things, because now it's very clear that the United States is really the one that's being perceived as the main facilitator, the main cover of the Israeli aggression. And that's just becoming clear. And that's becoming very, very problematic. And that's only exasperating Western perceptions in the Middle East in general. And, you know, here, there are just some of the points that you mentioned. So there is an evolution in the sharpness of the language, and there is an evolution of the tone. So there's another aspect, is that the tone in itself became, and there's one thing here, that it became explicit. That's why these statements became, so they're really hinting, okay, the United, you know, the Security Council, we're calling on they're clearly hinting that, okay, there's the flaw, the international flaw is there, that this is 1 second, you know, this is it's illustrating the hypocrisy and double standards of a great deal of many of you. This is, again, not only the United States and the West, but it's also speaking to the, you know, against the backdrop of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is another horrible thing that's happening. But the response was completely different. And that didn't help. Or that, I wouldn't say that didn't help. That illustrated the point. And I was like, oh, wow. it was only a few months ago, a year and a half ago, that Ukrainian flags were being flown everywhere. Everyone's calling about the quote boycott. Now Palestinian flags are not allowed to be anywhere. And in places in Germany, etc., and they feel they're being, not, I won't say prosecuted, but cracked down. So they sense this, and they sense what's facilitating it, and people aren't stupid. If people aren't stupid, and the Saudi society, they're aware that what's facilitating all of this is the United States. And another thing to put on top of that too, they see that in the maritime coalition against the Houthis right now. So hold on. When Saudi Arabia was saying to the world that the Houthis is actually a very big problem, but the world was going against us. Now, because of shipping lanes and because of Israel, you're orchestrating this, and especially that we are trying to calm things down with the Houthis now. You're exasperating this again, or you're using tactical measures with strategic implications on us. So there's just a clear lack of harmony in how there's perceiving, and they don't want to take the cost of any of this lack of harmony. And they're just starting to see that, the short-sightedness of a great deal of Western actions are tactical, don't have enough consideration for the strategic implications for the Arab countries, and particularly Saudi Arabia, and that this heinous operation that's taking place now in Gaza is also another illustration that there is just not enough consideration for us. And clearly, and just like what King Abdullah of Jordan said, that's like, well, our lives doesn't seem to matter more than other people's lives. And on the and just maybe just a tiny few words on this as well. And other people will say the same thing, that our lives doesn't matter as much as theirs, and there is this accusation. And this is the reason why we are not ready for normalization. This is the reason why normalization we're just not ripe, because the entire world, the eyes of those interested, most of them at least, especially the ones that are politically invested in this, they're focusing on normalization. They haven't focused enough on peace. And that's why it's time to start focusing on the peace, which will then be the bedrock to normalization. And if those who are saying that they're going to want normalization now, then you know that they have really bad intentions, and that they're trying to have normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which I don't anticipate will happen, to remove any kind of last bit of leverage that will be used on Israel for the Palestinians. And I think the Saudis are understanding the weight of this.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. The piece about the Houthis and the domestic perception for Saudis of the international focus now on the Houthis is really, I actually had not, I hadn't thought about that. It's really it's a key point for the sort of myopia we have with our own interests, and not. I think there's often a forgetfulness that comes when people analyze normalization, of forgetfulness about domestic politics of the countries that are supposed to be normalizing, partly because we've been told that they don't really have domestic politics, which is just not true. All right, I have two more questions, and both of them are more looking ahead questions. So I want to shift gears for a minute. You published a piece recently entitled "A Revived Arab Peace Initiative from Saudi Arabia Could Save the Middle East." We're talking here about the API, so I'll be using the term API henceforth. In that piece, you talk about the original goal of the API and how its political purpose, how people use it, has evolved since 2002 when it was first released. And you conclude, quote, "The October 7 war is yet another tragic illustration of the results of a faulty policy of, quote, kicking the can down the road, which is not only a failure, but a strategic mistake with consequences for regional security. That is precisely why the API must be re-articulated with more explicit language in a more clearly defined peace process, with a more involved Saudi role on the negotiating table, as it, unlike the Abraham Accords, has the necessary building blocks and references for reaching a Palestinian-Israeli settlement. So you clearly have put a lot of thought into this. I want you to dig deeper into what you mean. What would
Okay.
an updated and strengthened API look like?
Yes.
How do you think it would find more traction than it did over the past 20 years? And what would a more involved Saudi role be? Because I'm old enough to remember back in 2002 and the release of this thing, this amazing opportunity, which the Saudi regime basically put out there and put a tremendous amount of political capital on the line by releasing, and then sort of step back, which
Mm,
allowed at the time, for folks to remember, it allowed the Israelis to argue that it was a trap, that the whole
yeah.
idea of regional normalization was a trap. The whole thing was a trap. So how would it be different this time?
No, and you're right. There is I mean I remember it and in 2002 and just to say there was two things happening at the time in the world. There was an intifada because it was a response of the intifada. It was a result of the intifada. And secondly, 9/11 was happening too. It was just after 9/11. And as a result, American Saudi relations were incredibly tense, very, very tense. And that's an important issue because that's where I think looking forward, where how can we get an American push and a Saudi push more in sync for the future. But just a few words on the Arab Peace Initiative. So you're right, the way they articulated it and stood back, and that it was therefore designed not as a diktat, because a great deal of what is some Israelis, not all Israelis, there are some Israelis that say this was a clear missed opportunity, but that some who rejected it say that this is a diktat, that this was a take it or leave it approach. And this is can't be further from the truth, because what the Saudi foreign minister then said, Prince Saud al-Faisal, he said the strength of the Arab Peace Initiative is that it doesn't go into the details, that it is basically up for the negotiation. And then they said, well, is it negotiable? He said, it is negotiable. That it is to start in 2007, it was re-articulated again. And he said that the aim of the Arab Peace Initiative is to start negotiations. So therefore, it's important to look at I would suggest to look at not just the language of the API, but the language around the API by Saudi Arabia, act as this kind of explication, as in making this language, it was designed to be implicit, to get Arab consensus and facilitate negotiations with Israel. And therefore, that's its strength. But at the same time, if people don't want to pick up the signals, then, or people could use it to say, well, it's not explicit enough. You clearly don't say that. And therefore, it is not strong enough. And no, instead, let's look at other things. Let's look at the Abraham Accords, or let's look at a different approach, because at the heart of the Arab Peace Initiative was the in-out approach, as in solve the issue and then go out. Now, someone like, others, I remember it was Yamos Adlin in 2014, where he met Turki al-Faisal, Prince Turki al-Faisal, who was the Saudi director of intelligence from 1977 to 2001, and now meets unofficially in some of these platforms to discuss with former Israeli officials to explicate the Arab Peace Initiative and say, listen, it's designed to be this, just accept it, and we could negotiate all of these things. And the response is, no, you know what, let's move out, let's have normalization, and this will then go into the issue, solve the issue. And here is where I think this is what the Abraham Accords is emblematic of. It's an emblematic of the fact that, no, of the out-in approach, But in fact, I don't think it was they've normalized relations, UAE, Bahrain normalized relations, and then they may address the issue. But they've been tested. And any kind of examination of the Abraham Accords, firstly, the Abraham Accords is a series of bilateral agreements, not a multilateral agreement like the Arab Peace Initiative was. So it was a series of bilateral agreements. And in that bilateral agreement, it was all kind of designed to circumnavigate, dance around the Palestinian issue, and to constitute and entrench that relationship and protect it away from any regional turbulence that we see now, for example. So we've seen that in May 2021, and then we're seeing it now. And therefore, people are saying, don't worry, we're going to leverage it for the Palestinians. How? There isn't any. There isn't any leverage. And because they don't have UN Security Council 242, there isn't 338, 338, not 3338, just 338. Unlike the Arab Peace Initiative. Now, the Arab Peace Initiative, this implicit discussion, this implicit communication, this goes back now, we're going back to the Arab Peace Initiative. I think it's time to be more explicit now. I think it's time to say no. Let us really sit down, be very explicit with what we want and what are the conditions for normalization. And here, I think where I say the Saudis could be on the table is that I'm trying to speak to a fundamentally flawed paradigm of the kind of the peace process, where the peace process had the Palestinian element, and then the Israeli element, and the protector of the United States, which can be argued sometimes as more Catholic than the Pope. So you have a regional power, an occupied people, a regional power, followed by the superpower. And it's basically structurally impossible. It was structurally doomed to fail. And by putting Saudi Arabia now in that final discussions, and the discussions, that's a different topic. No, nothing is ripe now for discussions. We have to stop what's happening. But in the future, I think the Saudis will be and should be on that table to reduce that symmetry and to provide the necessary wiggle room and incentives to get it cross that, to get it to cross that line. And because for me, I think what infuriates me and motivates me at the same time as a researcher was seeing how tangible peace could have been. Peace could have been really tangible. It was actually not that far off. But notwithstanding the structurally flawed, the lack of harmonious regional and international push, if all these things just were addressed, I think we could really we could really get it. And I may be idealistic.
I mean, what you articulating certainly is how it felt in 2002. There was a moment of extraordinary hope and promise there, and then it crashed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But I appreciate what you're laying out as something that is certainly an aspiration once we get past the current crisis. So in my final question, I've kept you much longer than I like to keep people for podcasts. I apologize, but I just so appreciate your perspectives. I want to ask you to pull out that damned crystal ball, which we all hate. And sort of given where things stand today, which is pretty horrific, I guess I want your thoughts on where you see Saudi's role right now. And here we're talking again, we're now, for some of us, we've been talking for more than 4 months about the likelihood of Palestinians, quote unquote, voluntarily migrating out of Gaza after they've been pushed and there's nowhere else to go. I mean, things like a new refugee problem issue in the region, that has regional implications that are almost unfathomable right now in terms of stability of various countries. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on how Saudi sees its role at that time, including pressure from the US, that's the Biden administration now, and potentially pressure from a second Trump administration, bearing in mind that the Saudi government has had, at least historically, in the last time around, had a very good relationship with
Yeah.
the Trump administration. So I guess like looking from assuming things, there isn't something that suddenly happens to put us on a better course in the next couple of weeks or days, what you think the Saudi role is, besides few and far between statements that I would agree with you need to be taken seriously. Generally, as a diplomat, you learn that the less someone says, the more you should pay attention to what they do say.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Exactly.
and this is the last question. So anything you want to say it here.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is what I will say. I would say, let me just touch on the Trump aspect. So yes, relations between Saudi Arabia and Trump, or the Trump administration and the Saudi ruling elite, were good, but they weren't very good, because and actually a lot. I think because there was a chemistry at the elite level. But in fact, I think one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia is really contemplating diversifying its international strategy a lot more, international security strategy a lot more, is because of Trump's lack of willingness to protect Saudi Arabia when it was attacked in 2019. And so, in addition, this is the same Donald Trump who said, well, Saudis, you won't live 2 weeks without me. And he said this before. Now, he said this to a different Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia now is going to be different than when he comes. So, and I think the Saudis will be keen to make sure that that's the case. So I think the ball is really also here in the region. What's going to happen here? In my opinion, there is already movement and coordination regarding what is going to take place and what is going to happen amongst the Arabs. And now with Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, UAE, and the Palestinians. And they met in Riyadh last Thursday. There was a ministerial meeting at the foreign ministry level where they were coordinating basically what is happening. How can they synchronize their efforts? And in my opinion, what is taking place security-wise, this is really the top security. I don't think anybody has a real I don't think anybody's is overly different. I think maybe the UAE may be different because the UAE lens is different. The UAE, because of its size and its position and its interests, it sees a lot more opportunities than it does see security threats and existential security threats. So therefore, the calculation is different. But right now, there's a clear Arab, in that mini-lateral Arab leadership front, they're making, the pushing in of refugees, not only to Egypt, but the threat of it going and spilling over into Jordan will cause incredible amount of instability. And quite frankly, in my opinion, I'm not really sure that now people see enough strategic utility in Israel any longer. The perception of strategic utility of Israel has been diminished. Israel now has clearly become a cost. Now, it does have economic relations, etc. Okay, that's another thing. But when it comes to security, which is the most important thing for a lot of these countries, it's become a burden. And what I anticipate now is the response that they're coordinating the response. I anticipate a very anxious Middle East right now. And I think they're really focusing on what they could approach the United States with, because I think this is because they don't have a great deal of pressure on Israel. They're trying to pressure the United States or do something in the United States there. So I think that's what's happening. It's very hard to tell, to be honest, Lara. I mean, what's going to happen, because and to be honest with you, there's always been a red line, and then they shifted, and then the red line, and then there's another red line, and then there's another red line. And it's also what are they going to do?
I'll
In
just
my
also add in there, just if you want to comment, the question of UNRWA, because when we're talking about people are
Yeah,
focused on UNRWA in Gaza because that's what Israel wants to focus
yeah,
on right now. But if the current effort appears to destroy UNRWA, there appears to
yeah,
be about destroying UNRWA completely, which has implications in particular in Jordan and in Lebanon and also in Syria, which are, I mean, you start thinking about the regional security implications of the end of UNRWA, and I feel like analysts of the current situation are not really paying close attention there.
yeah, yeah. No, no, and thank you for bringing this in, because I think, well, the UNRWA head of UNRWA was in Saudi, and he was received by Prince Faisal bin Farhan. So I think the Saudis are understanding this, and again, it goes back to this regional security point. Now, what are they willing to do? I think now it's becoming, now it got crystallized a little bit looking at the crystal ball now. There are not many sticks that they could use. This is the reality. But I think there's a lot of carrots. And it's not one carrot. There's a lot of carrots. And this is kind of the nature of the Middle East now, the nature of especially Saudi approach, the Saudi approach with Iran. Confrontation with it didn't really bring about what it wanted. Using the carrots, incentivizing it has. And I think what they will utilize is a great deal of the carrots. And the biggest carrot they have is normalization. And I think they're communicating to the United States, because they're not saying, okay, Israel, we're not gonna normalize relations with you. In fact, Israel is just reducing its own agency in Saudi perception by doing this. And now this is a discussion between Saudi Arabia and the United States, and saying, listen, look at what's happening now. Look at what your little trouble problem child is doing. This is literally kind of the perception that, okay. And as a result, what we are going to ask for from you is a lot more, because they're causing a lot more costs. And this is the kind of approach that I see. This is the anticipation. But in order for this to happen properly, there needs to be a solid Arab front. And I think this solid Arab front is important now. And I think it's part of the Saudi regional policy and international policy that it can't do it alone. That, okay, while other countries can't certainly view Saudi Arabia as their part of their center of gravity, Saudi Arabia also sees them as essential for regional stability and for their policy too. So they're creating this regional front. I'm sorry, they're not a regional front. They're an Arab front that will lead to a regional front, which is also, there is space of discussion between them and Iran. There's a great deal of discussions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. There's a great deal of coordination between them. And actually, the relations have strengthened because they forced them to talk more and reinforce the notion that they're not against each other here. And so all of a sudden, I think the idealistic perceptions and ambitions that the United States, and as well as Israel, what they had is becoming less and less and less the longer this war continues.
It's just fascinating. All right, I'm warning you now. I'm going to be inviting you back in the future, possibly to talk about that last point on Iran, which I'd love to spend an hour digging into. I've already kept you here much longer than I said I would, so we're gonna stop here. Aziz, thank you so much for joining me today. Really a rich conversation where I learned a tremendous amount. I hope everyone else did too. For our audience, thank you for listening and watching. And you can follow Aziz on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. It's at Aziz Alghashian, Azizalghashian. I'll have that in the show notes. And finally, as always, I want to remind you to subscribe to the Occupied Thoughts podcast. You can do so on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. That way you don't miss any of our great content. And you can also find a video of the podcast, as always, on our website at www.fmep.org. So with that, we're going to end it here. Thank you, Aziz. I'm Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.